I found out about the fine when I came home from my shift at the hospital in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and saw the bright orange envelope wedged into my front door. The wind was howling that February evening, making my ears ache as I fumbled with my keys, and all I wanted was to get inside my townhouse and warm up. Instead, I got a $100 fine from the Meadowbrook Community Association for excessive vehicle idling in violation of Community Noise Ordinance Section 12.4. My name is Harold Quincy, and I'm a surgical technician at Moses Taylor Hospital. I work the early morning shift, which means I'm out the door at 5:30 in the morning, 4 days a week. My 2019 Honda Accord is my lifeline to work, and during these brutal Pennsylvania winters, I do what any sensible person does. I start my car and let it warm up for about 10 minutes before driving. It's not just about comfort. It's about engine longevity, fuel efficiency, and making sure my defroster actually works before I get on the road. I stood in my living room, reading the citation again, my jaw clenched. According to the fine, I had violated the noise ordinance 3 times in the past 2 weeks by warming my engine between 5:15 and 5:30 in the morning. Someone had filed a formal complaint. The letter was signed by Brenda Morrison, the HOA president, in her characteristic looping cursive that somehow managed to look both elegant and threatening. I'd lived in Meadowbrook for 3 years. It was a decent enough place, built in 2015 with rows of identical beige townhouses separated by narrow driveways and small patches of lawn. The HOA fees were reasonable at $200 a month, and for the most part, they stayed out of my business. But Brenda Morrison had been elected president last summer, and things had changed. She was in her mid-40s with short blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut, and she wore her authority like armor. The next morning, I decided not to warm up my car. I just couldn't afford another $100 fine on top of my student loans and mortgage. I scraped the ice off my windshield in the dark, my fingers going numb despite my gloves, and climbed into a car that felt like a meat locker. The engine turned over reluctantly, and I sat there shivering as I waited for even a trickle of warm air from the vents. By the time I got to work, my neck was stiff from hunching against the cold, and my mood was foul. "You look like death," my coworker Marcus said when I walked into the prep room. "New HOA rule," I muttered. "Can't warm up my car in the morning." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "That's insane. How are you supposed to drive in this weather?" Apparently, I'm supposed to just deal with it. But the real irony didn't hit me until later that week. I was coming home around 3 in the afternoon, driving through the maze of Meadowbrook streets, when I saw Brenda Morrison standing next to her silver Lexus SUV in her driveway. Her hood was up, and she was on her phone, looking frustrated. As I slowed down, she waved at me urgently. I pulled over, already knowing what the problem was. Brenda's husband worked in Philadelphia during the week, and she often left her car sitting for days at a time. In cold weather like this, batteries died fast. "Harold, thank God," she said as I got out. "My battery's completely dead." "Do you have jumper cables?" I did. I always kept a set in my trunk along with a roadside emergency kit. It was just basic common sense. Over the past 2 winters, I'd helped probably a dozen neighbors jump start their cars. It was the neighborly thing to do. But as I stood there, looking at Brenda's expectant face, something inside me shifted. This was the woman who'd just fined me $100 for warming up my car. This was the woman who'd made my mornings miserable, and now she wanted my help. "Actually, I don't," I said. Her face fell. "Are you sure? I could have sworn you helped the Patels last month." "I took them out of my car," I lied smoothly. "Fire hazard, you know how it is." "Oh," she looked genuinely distressed. "Do you know anyone else who might have cables?" "Sorry, I really need to get inside. Good luck, though." I got back in my car and drove the remaining 100 feet to my townhouse, feeling a petty satisfaction that I knew was probably beneath me. But I didn't care. I watched through my window as Brenda made more phone calls. Eventually, A tow truck showed up about an hour later. I found out later she'd had to pay $150 for the jump start and service call. The next morning, I didn't warm up my car again. The pattern continued for another week, my mornings getting progressively more miserable. Then, on a particularly bitter Thursday morning, I saw my neighbor across the street, an elderly woman named Patricia Chen, standing by her car with a confused look on her face. I walked over. "Car trouble, Mrs. Chen. It won't start," she said, her breath misting in the frigid air. "Just clicking sounds. Dead battery." I helped her back inside her house where it was warm and then grabbed my cables. 10 minutes later, her car was running and she was thanking me profusely. "You're such a sweet young man," she said, "not like some people around here." I didn't ask what she meant, but I had a feeling. Over the next few days, I noticed a pattern. Several other cars in the neighborhood wouldn't start in the mornings. The Johnsons 2 houses down, the Martinez family on the corner. Each time I saw them struggling, and each time I assessed whether to help based on one simple criterion. Had they ever complained about me? Had they ever sided with Brenda's increasingly aggressive HOA enforcement? Mrs. Chen, I helped. The Johnsons, who'd always been friendly, I helped. But the Martinez family, whose son had testified at an HOA meeting about my disruptive morning routine, I walked right past. I saw Robert Martinez standing in his driveway, looking at his dead Nissan Sentra, and I kept walking to my car. "Hey, Harold," he called. "You got cables?" "Nope, sorry," I called back, not even slowing down. It was amazing how quickly word spread in a small community like Meadowbrook. By the end of February, at least 8 or 9 cars had needed jumps, and I'd helped exactly 3 people. The others had to either call for service or beg other neighbors, most of whom didn't have cables or didn't want to bother. Then came the second HOA meeting of the year, scheduled for the first Tuesday in March. These meetings were held in the community center, a bland rectangular building near the neighborhood entrance. I normally didn't attend because they were boring recitations of landscaping schedules and budget reports. But this time, I got a personal notice in my mailbox that my attendance was strongly encouraged. I knew what that meant. Brenda wanted to make an example of me. The community center was about half full when I arrived, maybe 40 people scattered among the folding chairs. Brenda stood at the front with her laptop and projector, wearing a crisp blue blazer that screamed, "I'm in charge here." Her vice president, a thin man named Douglas Carter who always looked vaguely uncomfortable, sat beside her. The treasurer, Emily Thornton, was reviewing papers. "Let's call this meeting to order," Brenda said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. She went through the usual preliminaries, talking about snow removal costs, upcoming landscaping bids, and a proposal to repaint the community center. Then she got to violations and compliance issues. "We've seen an uptick in noise violations this winter," she began, clicking to a PowerPoint slide. "Specifically, residents running their vehicles for extended periods in the early morning hours. This is disruptive to neighbors and violates our community standards." I felt eyes turning toward me. I kept my face neutral. "We've issued several fines for this violation, and I want to make it clear that we'll continue to enforce this rule strictly. If you need to drive somewhere, you can let your car warm up for 2 or 3 minutes max. Anything beyond that is excessive." Mrs. Chen, bless her, raised her hand. "Brenda, isn't 10 minutes pretty standard for warming up a car in winter? I remember my late husband always did that." "Modern cars don't need that long," Brenda said dismissively. "And regardless, we have to think about the whole community. People are trying to sleep." "At 5:30 in the morning," I said, unable to help myself. "Most people are getting up around then anyway." Brenda's eyes locked onto mine. "The rule applies at all hours, Harold. If you have an issue with that, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the board. I'm just saying, it seems like a pretty unreasonable rule when it's 15 degrees outside and people need to get to work safely." "Safety isn't an excuse for being inconsiderate to your neighbors," Brenda shot back, And speaking of being considerate, there's another matter we need to address. Here it comes, I thought. Several residents have reported that when they've needed assistance with car troubles recently, certain neighbors have been unwilling to help. This is disappointing because part of living in a community means looking out for each other. I almost laughed at the audacity. Are you seriously trying to mandate that people help each other jump-start cars? Is that going to be a new HOA rule too? A few people chuckled, but Brenda's face hardened. I'm saying that community spirit matters, Harold. We all need to do our part. I do my part. I pay my HOA fees on time. I follow the rules, even the unreasonable ones. But you can't fine me for not helping you when your battery dies after you've spent the past month making my life harder. The room went quiet. Douglas shifted uncomfortably. Emily looked down at her papers. Brenda's voice was ice. This isn't personal, Harold. It sure feels personal when I'm the one getting fined. You were fined because you broke a rule, multiple times. If you don't like the rules, you can petition to change them, but you don't get to just ignore them. And you don't get to demand I help you after you've harassed me, I replied. That's not in any rule book. The meeting deteriorated from there. Other residents started chiming in, some supporting Brenda's enforcement approach, others questioning whether the idling rule was too strict. The whole thing devolved into a 40-minute argument that resolved nothing. I left feeling vindicated but also exhausted. Over the next 2 weeks, the cold snap continued. More batteries died. I helped Mrs. Chen twice more, along with the Patels, the Johnsons, and a new family that had just moved in. But I conspicuously avoided helping anyone I knew had sided with Brenda, which was becoming a longer list as she rallied her supporters. Then the fines escalated. I got another citation in mid-March, this one for $150, claiming I'd idled my car for 15 minutes. I hadn't. I'd barely warmed it up for 5 minutes before driving away, but someone had reported me anyway. When I tried to contest it, providing my dash cam footage showing I'd only been in my driveway for 7 minutes total, Brenda rejected my appeal, saying the dash cam didn't prove the car wasn't running before I got in it. That was when I realized this wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control. Brenda wanted to win, and she'd bend any rule to do it. I started documenting everything. Every morning, I took time-stamped photos of when I started my car and when I left my driveway. I kept my dash cam running continuously. I even set up a cheap security camera pointed at my driveway to record the entire morning routine. If Brenda wanted to play hardball, I'd match her with evidence. The third fine came in early April. $200 this time, with a threat that continued violations could result in further action, including potential legal proceedings. My stomach sank when I read that. I couldn't afford a legal battle with the HOA. Those things cost thousands of dollars even if you won. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table and did something I'd never done before. I started researching Pennsylvania HOA law. I learned that while HOAs had broad authority, they couldn't enforce rules that violated state law or that were arbitrary and capricious. I learned about the requirement for reasonable notice, proper procedures for fines, and the right to a fair hearing. I also learned that selective enforcement, where rules were applied to some residents but not others, was grounds for challenging HOA actions. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. I cited specific Pennsylvania statutes, pointed out that I'd been denied a proper hearing, noted that the idling rule was selectively enforced since I'd observed multiple other residents warming their cars without being fined, and demanded that all fines be rescinded. I sent copies to all 3 board members via certified mail. Brenda's response came a week later. She rejected everything, claimed the enforcement had been proper, and reiterated the threat of legal action if I continued to violate community standards. I was furious, but I was also scared. I couldn't afford a lawyer. I couldn't afford to keep paying these escalating fines. But I also couldn't just let Brenda bully me into submission. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chen called me one evening in late April. "Harold, dear, do you have a minute? I'd like to talk to you about the HOA situation." I went over to her house, a mirror image of mine but filled with decades of accumulated warmth and memory. She offered me tea and we sat in her living room. "I've been talking to other neighbors," she said, "about Brenda and the way she's been running things. You're not the only one who's unhappy." I figured as much. There's going to be a special election for the board in June. We have enough signatures to force it, and I think you should run for president. I almost spit out my tea. "Me, Mrs. Chen, I don't know anything about running an HOA. You know more than you think, and more importantly, you understand that rules should be reasonable and fairly applied. Brenda has forgotten that. She treats this place like her personal kingdom. I don't think Brenda would take kindly to that. Brenda doesn't get a vote in whether we hold an election. The bylaws are clear. 20% of homeowners can petition for a special election, and we have 23%, she smiled. We've been busy. Over the next few days, I met with other frustrated residents. The Johnsons, who'd been fined for putting their trash cans out one day early. The Martinez family, who despite initially supporting Brenda had soured on her after she'd fined them for having a decorative garden gnome that violated the aesthetic standards policy. The Patels, who'd been cited for parking their work van in their driveway overnight. Even people I barely knew had stories of Brenda's overreach. The petition was filed on May 1st. According to the bylaws, the election had to be held within 45 days. Brenda tried to fight it, claiming procedural irregularities, but the bylaws were clear. She was stuck. I filed my candidacy for president on May 10th. So did Brenda, obviously, and Douglas threw his hat in the ring too, though I suspected he was just trying to split the anti-Brenda vote. The campaign period was short, just 4 weeks, but it was intense. Brenda went negative immediately. She sent out flyers claiming I was trying to eliminate all community standards, that I wanted to turn Meadowbrook into a lawless neighborhood where people could do whatever they wanted. She held a community barbecue, which was really just a campaign event where she stood by the grill and told everyone who'd listen that I was a troublemaker who didn't respect the community. I took a different approach. I went door to door, talking to neighbors, listening to their complaints and promising simple reforms. Reasonable idling times in winter, a proper appeals process for fines, clearer communication from the board, an end to selective enforcement. I wasn't promising to eliminate rules. I was promising to make them fair. Mrs. Chen became my unofficial campaign manager. She organized a meeting at her house where 20 neighbors showed up, and I laid out my platform. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were tired of Brenda's authoritarian approach. They wanted their HOA to be a service organization, not a police force. The election was held on June 18th, a Saturday, in the community center. Voting was from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. I spent the day nervously walking around my house, unable to focus on anything. Mrs. Chen called me at 5. "Get down to the community center, they're counting the votes." I practically ran there. The room was packed with residents, all waiting for the results. Brenda stood near the front, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Douglas looked relieved just to have it almost over. Emily Thornton, as treasurer, was overseeing the count. At 5:30, she stood up to announce the results. For the position of HOA president, the votes are as follows: Douglas Carter, 32 votes, Brenda Morrison, 94 votes. Harold Quincy, 121 votes. The room erupted. People were clapping, some were cheering. I felt dizzy. I'd actually won. By a substantial margin, I'd beaten Brenda. Brenda's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally a cold, hard mask. She walked out without saying a word. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of transition. I had to learn the administrative side of running an HOA, managing the budget, coordinating with the management company that handled landscaping and snow removal, reviewing contracts, and understanding all the bylaws inside and out. Douglas stayed on as vice president, and Emily remained treasurer. We formed a functional, if not exactly friendly, working relationship. My first act as president was to repeal the excessive idling rule and replace it with something reasonable. 5 to 15 minutes of warm-up time in winter months was fine. Anything over 30 minutes might be excessive and would be handled on a case-by-case basis with a warning before any fine. The new rule passed unanimously at our first board meeting. I also established a proper appeals process for fines, created clearer communication channels, and started a monthly newsletter to keep residents informed about HOA activities. Small things, but they mattered. Brenda, meanwhile, became increasingly bitter. She still lived in Meadowbrook, but she stopped coming to HOA meetings. She stopped participating in community events. The few times I saw her, she'd glare at me and turn away. Then, in August, something strange happened. The HOA bank account was suddenly short $5,000. Emily discovered it during a routine reconciliation. She called me immediately. "Harold, we have a problem. There's a discrepancy in the accounts. Money is missing." We went through the records carefully. The money had been withdrawn in 3 separate transactions in May and June, right before the election. Each withdrawal had been authorized by a board signature. Brenda's signature. I felt sick. What were these withdrawals supposedly for? Emergency landscaping repairs, according to the notes. But I checked with the landscaping company and they say they were never paid these amounts. Their records don't match ours. So where did the money go? Emily looked grim. "I think we need to call the police." I didn't want to believe it. Even though Brenda and I had clashed, even though I thought she was a petty tyrant, embezzlement was serious. It was criminal. But the evidence was damning. The money was gone and the stated purpose was fraudulent. We filed a report with the Scranton Police Department. Detective Lisa Marshfield was assigned to the case. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 30s who took detailed notes as Emily and I explained the situation. "You have documentation of all these transactions?" she asked. "Everything," Emily said, handing over a thick folder. "Bank statements, withdrawal authorizations, communications with the landscaping company, all of it." Detective Marshfield spent 2 weeks investigating. She interviewed Brenda, who claimed the money had been spent on legitimate expenses and that the landscaping company must have made a mistake in their records. But when the detective subpoenaed Brenda's personal bank records, the truth came out. Brenda had deposited 3 checks into her personal account, each matching the amounts of the HOA withdrawals. She'd written the checks to herself from the HOA account, using her authority as president. The money had paid for a family vacation to Florida, new furniture for her house, and various personal expenses. In September, Brenda Morrison was arrested and charged with theft and misappropriation of funds. The amount involved made it a 3rd-degree felony in Pennsylvania, punishable by up to 7 years in prison and significant fines. The neighborhood was stunned. People who'd supported Brenda felt betrayed. People who'd opposed her felt vindicated but also saddened. This was supposed to be a community, and now we were watching one of our own face criminal charges. Brenda's court proceedings dragged on through the fall. Her lawyer tried to argue that the withdrawals had been authorized and that any misuse was unintentional, a bookkeeping error rather than deliberate theft. But the prosecution had bank records, emails, and testimony from Emily and the landscaping company. The case was solid. In December, Brenda accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to misappropriation of funds in exchange for the theft charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to repay the $5,000 plus penalties and court costs, and required to complete 200 hours of community service. She also had to resign from any position of authority in the HOA and agree never to serve on the board again. It was a relatively light sentence, but it was justice. The HOA got its money back and Brenda faced consequences for her actions. Through all of this, I kept my regular routine. I warmed up my car every winter morning, 10 to 15 minutes, no apologies. I helped neighbors with their dead batteries, not keeping score anymore, just being helpful because it was the right thing to do. Mrs. Chen still thanked me profusely every time I helped her. The Johnsons invited me over for dinner. The Patels brought me homemade samosas. By the time spring came around again, Meadowbrook felt different. The atmosphere was lighter, less tense. People chatted in their driveways. Kids played in the common areas. The HOA functioned the way it was supposed to, maintaining the property and serving the residents, not controlling them. One morning in March, almost exactly a year after that contentious HOA meeting, I was warming up my car before work when I saw Brenda come out of her house. She was dressed for exercise, probably heading to the small gym in the community center. Our eyes met across the street. For a moment, I thought she'd just ignore me as she'd done for months, but then she walked over. I tensed, unsure what to expect. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. Her face looked older than I remembered, more lines around her eyes. "For everything. The fines, the way I treated you, all of it. I let the power go to my head, and then when I was losing control, I made even worse choices." I didn't know what to say. "I accept your apology. I'm moving," she continued. "My husband and we're relocating to Pittsburgh. He got a transfer, and honestly, I can't stay here anymore. Too much shame, too many bridges burned." She looked around at the rows of townhouses. "I thought I was making this place better. I thought I was protecting property values and maintaining standards. But I forgot that these are homes, not just properties, and the people living here are neighbors, not subjects." "We all make mistakes," I said, though privately I thought hers had been particularly egregious. "Some mistakes cost $5,000 and a criminal record," she said with a bitter smile. "Take care of this place, Harold. Do better than I did." "I'm trying." She nodded and walked away. I never saw her again after that. The Morrison house went up for sale in April, and by June, a young couple with a newborn moved in. They were friendly and quiet, and they didn't care at all about HOA politics. The following winter was my second as HOA president. I'd learned a lot in that time about budgets, maintenance schedules, contractor negotiations, and resident relations. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was satisfying in its own way. I'd helped create a community where people felt heard, where rules made sense, and where enforcement was fair. And every single morning, when the temperature dropped below freezing, I started my car and let it warm up properly. Usually about 12 minutes, just enough to get the engine temperature up and the cab comfortable. My Honda Accord purred contentedly in the cold dawn, and not once, not ever again, did anyone complain. I also kept my jumper cables in the trunk. That winter, I helped 11 different neighbors get their cars started. Mrs. Chen, of course, whose battery seemed to die monthly. The Johnsons twice. The new couple in Brenda's old house. Even the Martinez family, who apologized sheepishly for not supporting me earlier. "Don't worry about it," I told Robert Martinez as his Sentra's engine finally caught and roared to life. "We're all just trying to get along here, and that was the truth of it." A community wasn't about rigid enforcement or petty power plays. It was about people helping each other, making reasonable accommodations, and treating each other with basic respect. Those were the principles I tried to lead with, and most days they worked. There were still challenges, of course. In my second year, we had a dispute about whether residents could install solar panels, which some people thought would look ugly. We had arguments about guest parking and whether the pool hours should be extended. We had the usual complaints about dogs barking, kids playing too loudly, and the eternal struggle over how green the common area grass should be. But we handled these issues through discussion and compromise, not through authoritarian decrees and escalating fines. When conflicts arose, we talked them through. When rules needed updating, we solicited input from residents. When someone had a legitimate grievance, we listened. The solar panel dispute was resolved by creating guidelines that allowed panels, but required them to be installed in a way that minimized visual impact from the street. The parking issue was handled by designating specific guest spots and creating a simple online reservation system. The pool hours were extended by 1 hour on weekends during the summer, a compromise that satisfied most people. Not everyone was happy all the time. That was impossible. But people felt like they had a voice, and that made all the difference. By my 3rd year as president, I was actually getting a little tired of the role. The administrative work was tedious, the meetings were often boring, and I missed having my evenings free. But every time I considered stepping down, someone would thank me for something, Mrs. Chen praising my fairness, a new resident appreciating the clear communication, a family grateful that we'd handled their fence dispute reasonably, and I'd remember why I'd run in the first place. In June, 3 years after I'd first been elected, we held our regular HOA elections. I ran again, mostly because no one else wanted the job and won easily. But this time, I made it clear that I'd only serve 1 more year. It was time to start grooming a successor, someone who understood the principles of fair governance and community service. I found that person in an unexpected place. Sarah Winters, the young mother who'd moved into Brenda's old house, approached me after a board meeting. "I've been thinking about getting more involved," she said. "I'm a paralegal and I work from home, so I have flexible hours. Would you consider mentoring me? Maybe I could shadow you, learn how things work, and then run for a position next year." "I think that's a great idea," I said, feeling a sense of relief. "Welcome to the team." Over that final year, Sarah attended every meeting, helped with administrative tasks, learned the bylaws inside and out, and proved herself to be thoughtful, fair, and patient. When I announced I wouldn't run for re-election, she threw her hat in the ring and won by a landslide. At the transition meeting, I handed over all the files, passwords, and institutional knowledge I'd accumulated. "The most important thing," I told her, "is to remember that you're serving the community, not ruling it. When you forget that, everything goes wrong." "I'll remember," she promised. And she did. Under Sarah's leadership, Meadowbrook continued to thrive. The community garden she'd proposed was built, the playground equipment was updated. The HOA fees remained stable while services improved. As for me, I went back to being just another resident. I worked my shifts at the hospital, came home to my quiet townhouse, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of not having to deal with community politics anymore. I still helped neighbors with dead batteries, still warmed up my car every winter morning, and still felt grateful that I'd taken a stand all those years ago. Because that's what it had really been about, not the car idling specifically, but the principle that rules should serve people, not the other way around. That authority should be exercised with humility and restraint. That communities work best when everyone has a voice and when leaders listen more than they dictate. Sometimes, on cold winter mornings, I'd think about Brenda Morrison and wonder how she was doing in Pittsburgh. I hoped she'd learned from her mistakes. I hoped she'd found some peace. But mostly, I just hoped she'd never gotten another position of power where she could make the same mistakes again. As I sat in my warming car one February morning, 5 years after this whole saga had started, I watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Steam rose from my exhaust pipe into the frigid air. My engine hummed smoothly, and I felt, more than anything else, a deep sense of contentment. I'd stood up for myself when it would have been easier to back down. I'd served my community when I could have just walked away. I'd tried to lead with fairness and integrity, and while I hadn't been perfect, I'd done my best. The dash clock read 5:27, time to head to work. I put the car in reverse, pulled out of my driveway, and drove through the quiet streets of Meadowbrook as the neighborhood slowly woke up around me. Life had returned to normal, or maybe better than normal. The HOA functioned quietly in the background, doing what it was supposed to do, maintaining the property, facilitating community life, and staying out of people's way. No one was getting fined for warming up their cars. No one was embezzling funds. No one was wielding petty authority like a weapon. Just neighbors living their lives, helping each other out when needed, and treating each other with basic human decency. It wasn't complicated. It never had been. It just took someone willing to stand up and say enough was enough. And as I merged onto the highway, heading toward another day at the hospital, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I'd handle them the same way I'd handled Brenda Morrison and her unreasonable fines. With patience, with documentation, with a commitment to what was right, and with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've stood your ground when it mattered. The engine ran smoothly, the heater pumped out warm air, and the road stretched out before me in the early morning light. Life was good. The community was strong, and somewhere in the universe, karma was smiling. Because at the end of the day, that's what happens when you treat people fairly and stand up against those who don't. Justice might not be swift, but it's patient, and eventually it arrives.